Nervea never believed in monsters, not truly. She had studied the history of the Zirithian people, their peaceful ways, their commitment to knowledge over conflict. Monsters belonged to the old tales, stories whispered to frighten younglings into obedience. And yet here she was, lying half-buried under twisted metal and shattered stone, staring at real monsters. The great marauders stormed through the ruins of her city, their guttural voices barking orders, their heavy boots crushing the remains of Zirithian civilization beneath them. Their armor gleamed under the fires consuming the skyline, and their jagged weapons dripped with the blood of the unarmed. Nervea struggled to move, but the wreckage of her research station pinned her in place. Pain shot through her side, broken ribs probably. She could feel the sticky warmth of blood pooling beneath her. She clenched her jaw. Panic wouldn't save her. Above her, the sky wept fire. Ships clashed in the atmosphere, streaks of plasma painting the heavens with chaos. The Zirithian defense forces had tried to hold the line, but their fleet was built for exploration, not war. Their ships fell like dying stars, burning out one by one. The realization chilled her more than the pain. They were losing. A deep, guttural voice cut through the night. A great captain. Nervea could see him through the cracks in the debris. A hulking brute with dark grey skin and cruel, slitted eyes. He gestured to his warriors, his tone almost amused. The scholars run, the warriors fall. This was no conquest. It was a slaughter. The great laughed. Sound a cruel, grinding ras. Nervea clenched her fists. The Zirithians had never been a warlike people. They sought harmony, understanding, peace. That was why she had chosen to become a scholar, so she could learn, so she could teach. But the universe had no use for pacifists tonight. The Great was searching now, kicking over bodies, pulling Zirithians from the rubble. Executions. She stilled her breath. If she moved, if they saw her, she would die. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her vision swimming from pain and fear. This was it. This was where her story ended. Then, thunderous footsteps. Nervea barely had time to register the new presence before a deafening crack split the air. The great captain's head exploded in a mist of black blood, his body crumpling to the ground before the laughter had even faded from his lips. For a moment, the other great froze, stunned. Then the battlefield erupted in chaos. More gunfire, precise, controlled, merciless. Great warriors dropped one by one, their snarls turning into screams as something unstoppable carved through their ranks. Nervea squinted through the smoke, her breath catching. A solitary figure strode through the wreckage, rifle blazing, armor scarred but unyielding. His movements were sharp, efficient, every shot a kill. He used cover like a predator, weaving through the debris with unnatural speed, ruthless and methodical. A human. Her people spoke of humans in hushed, cautious tones. They were terrors on the battlefield. Warriors unlike any the galaxy had seen. Many Zirithians believed humans were little more than brutes, unchained beasts who fought because it was all they knew. But as she watched this one cut down an entire squad of great soldiers without hesitation, she realized something. This wasn't rage. This was something colder, sharper, a force of nature. Then his eyes locked onto hers. She flinched, expecting. She wasn't sure what. Violence. A demand. Instead, he rushed to her side, holstering his rifle without hesitation. "You still breathing?" His voice was rough, battle-worn, but not unkind. She blinked. A human was talking to her, helping her. He took her silence as a yes. Good. Let's fix that whole trapped under rubble thing. Before she could respond, he gripped the wreckage, pinning her down, his muscles flexing. He gritted his teeth, veins straining against his skin, and the debris shifted. Nervea gasped. Zerithians were not weak, but even their strongest would have struggled to lift this weight alone. Yet this human, he was injured, blood trailing down his arm, and still he managed to move mountains for a stranger. Finally, the last chunk of rubble gave way. He exhaled sharply, offering her a hand. On your feet, we've got to move. She hesitated. This close, she could see his wounds, the exhaustion in his eyes. Yet he stood tall, as if stopping wasn't an option, as if pain was just background noise. Why? She whispered. Why are you helping me? He stared at her for a beat, then shrugged. Because you need it. A simple answer, a terrifying one. Because if this was the way humans thought, if their first instinct in battle wasn't conquest, but to protect, then the stories about them weren't just wrong. They were dangerously incomplete. And Nervea had a feeling she was about to learn the truth firsthand. Nervea's legs trembled as she took the human's offered hand. His grip was firm, steady, despite the blood seeping from a gash on his forearm. He pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing at all. The moment she stood, the pain flared. She staggered, gasping, clutching her side. The human's eyes flicked down, scanning her wounds with an unsettling sharpness. You're hurt. Can you run? She tried to straighten. I will manage. That's not what I asked. His tone was level, not harsh, but there was an undeniable authority behind it. Nervea hesitated, caught between her instinct to deny weakness and the knowledge that this man had already saved her once. I can move, she admitted. He nodded once, already turning. Then we're moving. Now. A great battle cry echoed through the ruined streets. Nervea flinched at the sound, but the human, he didn't even turn his head. He lifted his rifle, eyes sweeping the wreckage like a predator scanning for threats. Nervea had never seen a being so controlled. The great myths about humans always depicted them as violent berserkers, savage creatures who fought with reckless fury. But this man wasn't some mindless brute. He was precise, calculating, cold. And that was somehow far more terrifying. Another great warrior stepped into view, his plasma rifle raised. The human moved so fast, Nervea barely saw it. A single shot. The great's head snapped back, his body hitting the ground before his weapon even fell from his fingers. The human kept moving. A hesitation. No wasted motion. Nervea swallowed hard and followed. They weaved through the wreckage, darting through collapsed buildings and shattered corridors. Nervea tried to keep up, but the human moved like a creature born for war, his strides long, his body low, his eyes constantly scanning. A distant boom shook the city. She risked a glance up. In the skies above, the last of the Zerithian defense fleet was being torn apart. The sight sent a sharp pang through her chest. Her people were losing. The human must have noticed her hesitation because he glanced over his shoulder. Don't look back. Keep moving. She snapped her gaze forward. Where are we going? to my exfil point. That gave her pause. You came alone? He smirked, barely a hint of amusement flashing through his grim expression. Yeah, guess that was a bad idea. Yevaya's stomach twisted. He came alone. Re-race in the galaxy knew that humans rarely fought alone. They fought in packs, in armies, overwhelming their enemies with sheer force of numbers. Yet here was one man, one soldier, cutting through a great warband like they were nothing. She had spent years studying human military history. Logically, she knew what they were capable of, but knowing wasn't the same as seeing. And right now, Nevaeh was seeing something impossible. The sound of metal boots on stone snapped her back to the moment. More great warriors, 3 of them, cutting off their path. The human reacted before she could even cry out. He dropped to one knee, fired 3 times. 3 bodies hit the ground. She stared at him, breathing hard. How? He didn't answer. He was already moving again. They finally ducked into a half-collapsed structure, taking temporary refuge behind a crumbling wall. Nevaeh pressed a hand to her ribs, wincing. The adrenaline was keeping her upright, but she knew she wouldn't last much longer. The human knelt beside her, pulling something from his belt, a small metallic canister. "This'll hurt." Before she could ask what he meant, he pressed the canister against her wound. A sharp hiss filled the air as searing heat shot through her skin. She yelped, recoiling. "I said it'd hurt," he muttered, not unkindly. She scowled at him, but the pain was already fading, replaced by a dull numbness. She looked down. Her wound had been sealed with a strange synthetic film. Human battlefield medicine. Cathians had advanced medical technology, but their treatments required delicate procedures and carefully measured doses. Humans. They burned wounds, shut, and kept moving. Her gaze flicked back to the soldier. What kind of species was this? She exhaled. "Who are you?" He sat back on his heels. "Commander Ethan Cade, Terran Special Forces." Terran, the human homeworld. She had never met a Terran before. She hesitated, then offered her name. Nevaeh, scholar of the Zirithian High Order. His lips twitched in something almost like amusement. "Scholar, huh?" He glanced at the rifle she was still holding awkwardly in her hands. "Well, Nevaeh, welcome to field research. Hope you're taking notes." Before she could respond, his expression turned serious. He tapped his earpiece, frowning. Jamming field's still up. No contact with my team." Nevaeh's breath caught. "You mean, no one is coming for us?" Cade sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not yet, which means we're getting out of here on our own." Nevaeh felt a sinking weight in her chest. The city was crawling with Grate. Their fleet still controlled the skies. There was nowhere to run. Cade glanced at her expression and smirked. "Don't look so grim, Scholar. You've got a human with you." She blinked. "And that means?" His smirk widened slightly. "It means this fight just got interesting." The night air carried the stench of fire and death. Nervea crouched behind the remains of a collapsed transport station, her breath slow and controlled, just as Ethan had instructed. The numbness from the human's medical spray was wearing off, leaving behind a dull ache where her ribs had been broken. She ignored it. Pain was secondary. Survival was primary. And Cade was checking his weapon, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. He had barely spoken since their last encounter with the Great, his focus solely on getting them to safety. She should have felt useless. She was a scholar, not a soldier. Her knowledge lay in history, diplomacy, the grand philosophies of intergalactic peace. But right now, peace was a myth, and philosophy wouldn't save her. A great patrol moved in the distance, 7 warriors strong, sweeping the ruins with plasma rifles. Nervea instinctively tensed, but Cade didn't move. He watched, measured, calculated. Then, when the moment was right, he moved like a shadow slipping through the wreckage. She followed, mimicking his movements as best she could. Stay low. Move quietly. Watch his back. She wasn't sure when her instincts had shifted from flight to following the human's lead, but it had happened. Maybe because he was the only reason she was still alive. They weaved through the ruins, cutting through broken alleys and shattered corridors, avoiding direct contact. For a while, it seemed to be working. Then Cade stopped abruptly. Nervea almost ran into him before she saw what he saw, a great dropship lowering into the ruins ahead. Reinforcements. Cade exhaled through his nose. They're bringing in more troops. Bad news for us. We should change direction, Nervea whispered. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked to the Great, setting up a communications relay near the ship. His expression hardened. No. Nervea frowned. No. He adjusted his grip on his rifle. We take it out. She stared at him as if he'd gone mad. There are over a dozen soldiers there. And? Her mandibles clicked together in frustration. And we are 2 people. I am not even a soldier. Cade glanced at her. His smirk was as sharp as a blade. Then it's a fair fight. She wanted to argue. She really did. But the absolute certainty in his tone made the words die in her throat. Nervea had read about human confidence before. Many species considered it arrogance, recklessness. But what she saw in Cade's eyes wasn't arrogance. Was conviction. And she wasn't sure which was more terrifying. The trap is sprung. They moved into position on opposite sides of the great encampment. Cade's plan was simple. He would engage first, drawing their attention. She would use the distraction to destroy the relay. A terrible plan. A suicidal plan. And yet it was already in motion. A sharp crack rang out. Cade's first shot. One great soldier's head snapped back, body hitting the ground. The encampment erupted into chaos. The moment they turned toward the gunfire, Nervea moved. Heart pounding, she slipped through the wreckage toward the relay console. It was larger than she expected. Wires snaking across the debris, energy humming through its core. She pulled a shock charge from Cade's belt. He had given it to her without hesitation, as if trusting she would know what to do. She had no idea what she was doing. She placed the charge against the console, trying to remember what she had read about human demolition devices. Press, hold, on, move. The console beeped once. A warning light flashed red. Then she ran. Behind her, Cade was a force of nature. He had switched to close combat, his blade flashing, cutting down a Great who had gotten too close. One of the soldiers caught sight of Nervea. "Kithian, stop her!" Her blood ran cold. The Great raised his weapon. Boom! The relay exploded, the shockwave knocking her off her feet. Flames engulfed the encampment. Dazed, Nervea barely had time to register Cade grabbing her, hauling her behind cover as debris rained down. She gasped for breath, ears ringing. Cade was grinning, actually grinning. "Nice work, Scholar." She turned to him, still stunned. You trusted me to do that." He shrugged, reloading his rifle. "Yeah, why wouldn't I?" The answer was so casual, so simple, as if failure had never been a possibility. Nervea didn't know whether to be frustrated, amazed, or terrified. But one thing was clear. The stories about humans weren't just wrong, they were dangerously incomplete, and she had a feeling she was only beginning to understand why. The explosion still echoed in Nervea's ears as they moved. Cade led the way, navigating the ruins with the same unshakable confidence he had shown since the moment he rescued her. She followed, heart-pounding, forcing herself to match his pace. The Great Camp was gone. The relay was destroyed. But now they had a bigger problem. They were being hunted. Cade had noticed it first. A change in the air, the way the Great weren't moving in scattered patrols anymore. They were closing in, herding them towards something. "They're not chasing us," Cade murmured as they ducked into an abandoned marketplace, shattered kiosks and stalls casting jagged shadows. "They're driving us." Nervea swallowed. Toward what? Cade didn't answer immediately. His sharp eyes swept the ruins, scanning for something she couldn't see. Then his expression darkened. A trap. They moved deeper into the ruins, but Nervea could feel the noose tightening. The streets grew too quiet. The usual random bursts of great movement had stopped. A chill ran down her spine. They weren't dealing with normal soldiers anymore. They had sensed something else. A distant thud made her blood freeze. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't gunfire. It was footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Cade's jaw tightened. Shit. Nervea turned to him, heart pounding. "What?" Cade moved quickly, grabbing her arm and pulling her behind a crumbling pillar. They sent a hunter. She went rigid. A great apex hunter. Her mind flashed to every report, every warning about these elite warriors. Modified, enhanced, designed to kill anything they were sent after. He glanced at Cade, even him. The ground trembled again. Then another step. Closer. A shadow moved at the end of the street. Nervea's breath caught. The hunter was huge, even by Great standards. 7 feet of armored muscle, moving with unnatural grace for something so large. A long, wickedly curved blade gleamed in one hand. The other held a plasma caster, the barrel glowing faintly. Its head turned slightly, and she saw it, the glowing blue visor. Wasn't scanning for them. Already knew where they were. A slow, deep rumbling sound filled the air. Laughter. Then it spoke. Human. Asterisk, a growl, layered with amusement and hunger, asterisk. Nearveyor saw Cade's hands tighten around his rifle. His expression was stern. The hunter tilted its head. You made quite the mess. It took another step forward. Impressive. Then it moved. Fast. Cade shoved Nearveyor aside the instant the plasma blast tore through their cover. Stone exploded into shards as she hit the ground, rolling. Cade was already up, firing. His shots were precise, aimed for the gaps in the hunter's armor, but the great warrior was faster. It dodged, closing the distance in a blur. Cade barely avoided the blade swipe that would have bisected him. He ducked, rolling under the strike, coming up with his combat knife drawn. A knife against that? Nearveyor's instincts screamed at her to run, but something made her hesitate. Something about Cade. He wasn't fighting like a soldier anymore. He was fighting like a predator. The dance of death. The hunter lunged again, and Cade sidestepped at the last moment, his blade flashing. A spray of blue blood hit the ground. The hunter snarled, stumbling back. Nearveyor's eyes widened. He cut it. The great warrior looked down at the deep gash across its side, then back at Cade. The amusement was gone. Now it was angry. Cade exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Thought you guys were tougher than this. The hunter roared, lunging again. This time, Cade met it head on. They moved like lightning, blade against blade. Sparks flew as steel clashed with alien alloy. Cade wasn't just dodging, he was countering. Every strike, every movement was deliberate. Nearveyor had never seen anything like it. The myths said humans were brutal, wild fighters. They were wrong. Cade was precise. Efficient. Deadly. And for the first time, the hunter realized it. Its movements became less aggressive, more cautious. Cade smirked. Not so fun when your prey fights back, huh? Nearveyor saw her chance. While the hunter was focused on Cade, she raised her stolen plasma pistol, aimed for the visor, and fired. The shot hit dead center. The hunter recoiled with a distorted roar, its systems trembling. Cade didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing the exposed helmet wires, and ripped them free. The hunter staggered, its vision flickering, and Cade drove his knife into its throat. For a moment, there was silence. Then the hunter collapsed. Dead. The aftermath. Nearveyor was breathing hard. Cade crouched over the body, ripping his knife free, flicking off the blood like it was nothing. Then he stood, turning to her. Nice shot. She swallowed. I wasn't sure it would work. Cade grinned, shaking his head. That's the difference between you and me, scholar. He glanced down at the body. I don't do sure, I do necessary. A chill ran through her. He had just helped kill an apex hunter. Her professors would have fainted at the thought. But Cade? He was already moving again, reloading his weapon. He tapped his earpiece. Still jammed, but we can't stay here. He turned to her. We're close to my exfil point. You ready to move? Nevaeh exhaled, gripping her pistol. She wasn't sure what she was anymore. But one thing was certain. She wasn't the same scholar who had watched humans from afar. Now she was in their world, and she wasn't turning back. The apex hunter's body was still cooling when Cade grabbed Nevaeh's arm and pulled her into motion. We need to go. Now. She didn't argue. The fight had been loud, too loud. The rest of the Great wouldn't take long to realize their unstoppable hunter had been stopped. And when they did, they'd come down on them with everything. Cade led her through the ruins, moving fast but careful, keeping low where the shadows stretched long. Nevaeh's legs burned, her lungs fought for air, but she kept going. Complaining wouldn't help. Humans didn't complain when survival was on the line. A new threat. The wind shifted. Nevaeh smelled something strange, a bitter, acrid scent. Cade smelled it too. Burning metal. Plasma residue. A ship. Cade pulled her into the wreckage of a collapsed building, pressing himself against the wall. He peeked around the corner, then pulled back quickly, muttering a curse. Dropship? North sector? They're blocking the route. Nevaeh felt her stomach tighten. How many? Cade's jaw clenched. 2 squads plus another specialist. Maybe worse. Her mandibles tightened. They were waiting for us. Cade exhaled sharply. Yeah. The Great weren't stupid. Losing their hunter had made them cautious, but not weak. They weren't chasing blind anymore. They had figured out Cade's exfil point and got there first, which meant they were trapped. Nevaeh's mind raced. There had to be a way around. Another exit. Another plan. But Cade was already thinking ahead. We can't outrun them. He turned to her, eyes sharp. But we can outplay them. A decoy plan. Nevaeh listened as Cade outlined his plan. It was reckless. It was insane. It would probably work. Step 1. Cade would create a false attack from the ruins, make it look like they were trying to break through the blockade directly. Step 2. While the Great focused on him, Nevaeh would slip around the perimeter, reach a secondary terminal, and override the dropship's flight systems. Step 3. Escape in the stolen ship. Simple in theory. Suicidal in practice. She gave him a skeptical look. You want me to hack a Great dropship in the middle of their own forces? Cade smirked. Come on, scholar. You're supposed to be smart. She exhaled sharply. And what if you get killed before I finish? He shrugged. Then don't take too long. She stared at him, searching for any sign of hesitation, fear, doubt, anything. But Cade was steady as ever. He wasn't bluffing. He trusted her. And for some insane reason, she trusted him back. Fine, she said. Let's do this. Hell breaks loose. Cade disappeared into the ruins. Nevaeh moved the opposite direction, heart hammering as she crawled through broken infrastructure, staying out of sight. and chaos erupted. Boom! Gunfire! Explosions! Cade had opened fire on the blockade, taking out the first squad with a series of quick, brutal shots. The Great shouted orders, returning fire. The distraction was working. Nervea slipped past the firefight, reaching the dropship's landing pad. She ducked behind a supply crate, breathing fast. A lone Great officer was accessing the ship's systems. One guard, one chance. She gripped the stolen plasma pistol, steadying her nerves. Breathe. Aim. Fire. The shot hit perfectly, dropping the officer before he could react. She rushed forward, hacking into the ship's console. The screen flared to life. Great command codes flashed before her. She had done simulated drills on Great tech before, but this was real. No time for mistakes. Her fingers flew across the interface, overriding the manual lockout. Come on, come on. A warning klaxon blared. She had triggered an alert. Damn it. Too slow. Cade's last stand. Cade was still fighting, but Nervea could see he was running out of time. Great had regrouped, pressing forward. Too many of them. She slammed her fist against the console. Work, damn you. A final override command. The ship's engines roared to life. Cade heard it. He turned toward her, grinning. About time, scholar. But the Great weren't done. A heavy gunner aimed his repeater at Cade, a shot that would kill him instantly. Nervea didn't think. She acted. She grabbed the dropship's mounted turret and fired. The cannon shredded the Great forces, forcing them into retreat. Cade took the chance, sprinting toward the ship. He jumped onto the ramp just as Nervea lifted off. The Great fired after them, but it was too late. They were gone. The escape. The dropship broke through the atmosphere. Nervea could still hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Cade sat in the co-pilot's seat, breathing hard. Then he chuckled, actually laughed. You shot a damn turret? Nervea slumped back. Exhausted, I panicked. Cade smirked. Didn't look like panic to me. She looked at him, really looked at him. The human who had saved her life. The soldier who had fought an apex hunter and won. And the man who had believed, without hesitation, that she could do the impossible. She exhaled, mandibles twitching in something that felt suspiciously like a smile. We make a good team. Cade leaned back, watching the stars. Here, scholar, we do. The stolen Great dropship pierced the void, slipping into FTL as the chaos of the battlefield shrank behind them. For the first time in hours, Nervea allowed herself to breathe. They had done it. They had escaped. She glanced at Cade, still slumped in the co-pilot's seat. His breathing was steady, but exhaustion clung to his posture. The fight had drained him, physically and mentally. He had gone against an apex hunter, outmaneuvered an entire Great platoon, and still managed to pull off an impossible escape. But it had cost them. Their comms were still jammed. The ship was a Great military vessel, meaning the moment they dropped out of FTL, they'd be flagged as an enemy unit. And worst of all, the Great knew. They had seen who had humiliated them. A human. And a Zerithian scholar. This wasn't over. The broadcast. Cade stirred, rubbing his face before blinking at the ship's control panel. How long was I out? Not long, Nearveyor said. He exhaled, sitting up. His eyes flicked across the screens, assessing their situation instantly. Our messages. No safe channels. No allies waiting. Just the two of them, in enemy space, in a stolen warship. Then the emergency alert flashed. Nearveyor's stomach dropped as she opened the broadcast. Cryoritiliwarnint. FUGITIV is identified. A hologram flickered to life. Great Wall Command. And right in the center, a clear, high-definition image of Cade. His face, his name, his entire record displayed for all of known space to see. A human soldier, wanted, hunted. N. Her breath caught. Her face appeared next. Not as an ally, not as a captured academic. As an accomplice. The Great weren't just after Cade. They had branded her a traitor. Her mandibles tightened as the transmission continued. The human Cade Mercer is to be terminated on sight. The Zerithian Nearveyor is to be returned alive for interrogation. She shivered. Interrogation meant something very specific when it came to the Great. Survival wasn't enough anymore. Now, they had to disappear. The fallout? Cade watched the broadcast in silence. He didn't curse. He didn't panic. Then he reached out and shut it off. Well, he muttered. That complicates things. Nearveyor turned to him. They won't stop. Cade met her gaze. I know. She clenched her fists. You don't understand. They marked you as a kill-on-sight target, Cade. But me? She pointed to herself, mandibles flaring. They want me alive. They want to make an example of me. He exhaled, tilting his head. Are you scared? She hesitated. Then. Yes. It was the truth. But anger burned under the fear. She had spent her life studying humans, watching them from a distance, trying to understand what made them so dangerous, so unpredictable. Now she was living it. She had thrown herself into their war, their chaos, their defiance. And the Great had noticed. Cade watched her carefully, then said, Good. She blinked. What? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Fear means you're still thinking, still fighting. A small smirk. When you stop being scared, that's when you're dead. She exhaled sharply. Of course, that's how a human saw it. Nowhere left to run. Cade stood, stretching. All right. First things first, we ditch this ship. Nearveyor frowned. You want to abandon it? He gave her a flat look. It's a flying target. Every bounty hunter, merc, and great loyalist in this sector just got a lovely little notification about us. He tapped the control panel, bringing up a holographic map of nearby space. We need a neutral zone. Nearveyor scanned the display. Vorlis Station is closest. Cade snorted. Vorlis is a pirate den. Half the scum in the sector operate out of there. Here Vaya crossed her arms. Exactly. Cade raised an eyebrow. She continued, pirates don't care about great laws. They only care about profit, which means if we bribe the right people, we can disappear. Cade considered that. Then he grinned. Scholar, I think you're finally getting the hang of this. He ignored the warmth that spread through her chest at the compliment. I'll take that as a yes. The descent into the underworld. As the stolen dropship dropped out of FTL, Vorlis Station loomed ahead, a massive rusted construct of metal and stolen technology, floating on the edge of a dying star system. Cade let out a breath. All right, let's try not to get shot before we land. Nervea exhaled, agreed. Deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The Great wouldn't stop hunting them. And she wasn't sure what terrified her more, the Great's wrath or what she was becoming in order to survive. The moment Cade and Nervea stepped off the dropship onto Vorlis Station, the air changed. A held of oil, sweat, and desperation, a place where laws meant nothing and credits meant everything. Cade had seen places like this before. Nervea, on the other hand, she hadn't. She walked slightly closer to him, her eyes darting across the crowd. The station was packed with mercenaries, smugglers, and scavengers, some barely more than starving drifters, others armed to the teeth. And every single one of them had heard the bounty alerts, which meant they were being watched. The right kind of criminals. Cade kept moving, leading them through the winding streets of the station's lower sector. He didn't glance around, didn't slow down. He walked like he belonged. Nervea tried to mimic his confidence, but she still felt the weight of too many eyes. Finally, they stopped outside a rundown bar/black market hub. A holographic sign flickered above the door. The RAVAGERSDEN. Nervea frowned. You trust this place? Cade snorted. Trust? No. But if you're desperate, this is where you find solutions. He stepped inside. Negotiations with a shark. Bar reeked of cheap fuel and cheaper liquor. Hushed conversations filled the air, mixed with the occasional threat or the sound of a deal being sealed. At the far end, a bulky, reptilian alien leaned against a counter. Varlox, a Triscan fixer. He was exactly the kind of scumbag Cade needed. Cade slid into a seat. Varlox. The Triscan didn't even glance up. Mercer. A slow smirk spread across his scaled lips. You've got quite the bounty, friend. Cade leaned back. You know better than to try and cash it in. Varlox's yellow eyes flicked to Nervea. And her? A scholar turned fugitive. Interesting. She stiffened. Cade kept his voice casual. We need new IDs, a clean transport, and a way off this station before the wrong people come knocking. Varlox laughed. A deep, slow sound. That's a lot of favors, human. Cade smirked. I pay well. Varlox's amusement didn't fade. He drummed his claws against the table. All right, Mercer, I'll get you off-world, but I want something in return. Cade's expression didn't change. Here it comes. A dangerous offer? Varlox leaned forward. There's a shipment coming in. Valuable. But it's got protection. You help me get? His grin widened. You leave Vorlis alive. Iavea tensed. You want us to do a job for you. Varlox shrugged. I want you to survive. This is how you do it. Cade sighed. This wasn't what he wanted, but in a place like Vorlis, bargaining was the only way out. He glanced at Nervea. You up for this? She hesitated, then slowly she nodded. She had been running long enough. Kind to fight back. The setup. The job wasn't simple. A rival crew, the Ashbourne Syndicate, had intercepted a shipment of stolen tech that Varlox wanted back. The problem? The Ashbourne were brutal, well-armed, and paranoid. Their leader, a cybernetic warlord named Corsair, didn't take kindly to thieves, so the plan was simple but stupid. 1. Sneak into the Ashbourne's dockyard. 2. Steal the shipment back. Get out before Corsair turns them into bloody smears on the pavement. Easy. Or not. Infiltration begins. Hours later, Cade and Nervea crouched near the Ashbourne compound. Nervea adjusted her stolen combat gear. This feels wrong. Cade checked his sidearm. You're doing great. She gave him a sharp look. I haven't done anything yet. He grinned. Exactly. Before she could respond, Cade's comlink buzzed. Varlox's voice crackled through. Guards are shifting now. You've got 5 minutes before the next rotation. Nervea swallowed hard. Then let's move. The break-in? They slipped past the outer defences, sticking to the shadows. Nervea had never done anything like this before. Sneaking into a heavily armed criminal stronghold. Insane. But Cade was in his element. He moved like a ghost, guiding her through blind spots, signalling her when to stop. She found herself mirroring his movements. A guard passed inches away. She held her breath, pressing against the metal crates. Cade's hand was on her shoulder, a silent weight. The guard moved on. Cade nodded. Let's go. Nervea exhaled and followed. The heist takes a turn. They reached the shipment container. Nervea accessed the controls, fingers flying over the interface. Access granted. The crate unlocked with a hiss. She grinned. Got it. Then the alarms blared. Cade swore. Damn it, someone's onto us. The comlink buzzed again. Varlox's voice, this time less amused. You two might want to run. And then the ground shook. A massive figure stepped into the hangar. Corsair. Cybernetic limbs, burning red eyes, and an arsenal built into his body. His voice was like grinding metal. You should not have come here. Cade stepped forward, raising his gun. Nervea swallowed. This just became a fight for survival. Cade's fingers tightened around his weapon, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. The figure of Corsair, the Ashbourne warlord, loomed before them, the very embodiment of ruthless power. His cybernetic limbs hissed with hydraulics, and his glowing red eyes locked onto them with unyielding malice. He was a machine of war, his every movement a calculated act of violence. Nervea could feel the tension in the air, the weight of their situation settling like an anchor in her chest. They had made it this far, through the twisting shadows of Vola Station, only to be caught by a figure like this, impossibly dangerous, unstoppable. Cade was already moving. His sidearm flashed in the low light, his aim precise, but Corsair didn't flinch. The shots bounced off the warlord's reinforced armor, the impact sending sparks into the dim air, but doing little more than irritating Corsair. Foolish. Corsair's voice was low, rumbling like distant thunder. He took a single step forward, his massive frame blocking the exit. Cade didn't hesitate, his body moving instinctively, eyes scanning the room for anything he could use. Nervea had no illusions about what this would be. There was no escape. There was no clever trick or clever words that would get them out of this alive. This was a fight to the death, and the odds were stacked against them. She stepped back instinctively, eyes flicking to Cade's. Their fates were now tied together. The betrayal of trust, the looming danger, the constant sense of running, it had led them here. This moment would decide everything. "You're dead, human," Corsair growled, his hand reaching for the plasma cannon attached to his back. Cade's instincts flared. He dove to the side, pulling Nervea with him, just as the blast rang out. The explosion sent debris flying, and Nervea found herself tumbling to the ground, her head spinning. "Stay down." Cade's voice broke through the ringing in her ears. She barely registered his words before he was up again, firing shots from a second pistol, each one aimed to slow Corsair down. But the warlord barely acknowledged the attack, his red eyes flickering with amusement. Cade was already running, trying to lead him away from Nervea. His movement was fluid, tactical, but he knew it wasn't enough. Corsair would overwhelm them, both if they stayed in the open. "We need a plan," Nervea said, struggling to regain her footing, her chest tight with adrenaline. "We don't have one," Cade replied tersely, firing again. He glanced toward the massive overhead pipes that ran along the ceiling, a gleam in his eyes. "I've got an idea, but you need to trust me." Nervea nodded sharply. "Just don't get us both killed." Cade's lips twitched with a half grin before he darted toward a stack of crates. "Get ready," he muttered as he vaulted over them. The gamble. Corsair growled as he followed Cade's movements, each step heavy and deliberate. His cybernetic enhancements allowed him to process everything faster than a human, but it also made him predictable. He wasn't expecting Cade to dive into a corner and start setting explosives. Nervea's eyes widened. "Are you insane?" Cade didn't respond. Instead, he placed several small charges on the walls and ceiling. The devices were designed to overload the station's systems, setting off a chain reaction. Corsair might be able to tank bullets, but he wouldn't survive a station-wide meltdown. "We need him in the center," Cade muttered to himself as he finished planting the last charge. He flicked a switch on his wrist, sending a pulse to trigger the system. The countdown started. Corsair was close now. He swung his plasma cannon toward Cade, but Cade was already moving, dodging and weaving like a seasoned fighter. Corsair roared in frustration as Cade sprinted back toward Nervea, who had positioned herself near the farthest wall. "Run!" Cade shouted. But before Nervea could take a step, a sharp pain exploded in her side. Her breath caught in her throat, and she fell to her knees. The plasma blast had grazed her, but it was enough to knock the wind out of her. Cade's eyes went wide. No. He reached for her, but Corsair laughed. You think you can escape? But before Corsair could land another blow, a blinding light filled the room as the explosives Cade had set went off. The room shook violently, and Corsair's roar was swallowed by the shockwave. Dragged Nervea to safety as the entire structure of the station collapsed inward around them. Arcs flew, and the walls cracked, but they were already moving. The blast had thrown Corsair off balance. He had underestimated the human's ingenuity, and now he was caught in the explosive aftermath. They stumbled to their feet, breaths heavy and ragged. That's how you do it, Cade said, panting. He grinned at Nervea, but the relief was short-lived. Her injury still throbbed, the pain slowly creeping up on her. Are you all right? Cade asked, his voice softer. She nodded weakly, trying to catch her breath. I think I'm fine, for now. But they both knew this was only a temporary victory. Volus Station was a ticking time bomb, and as they made their way toward the stolen ship, the Great and the Ashborn were still hunting them. They had won today, but they knew better than anyone that survival came at a price. Cade's eyes hardened as they boarded the ship, preparing for their next move. The journey was far from over, and as Nervea took her place beside him, she realized one thing. Humanity had a strange way of surviving, no matter the odds.